She collapsed in the glass atrium and woke up at the breakfast table, wearing someone else's jewelry. She had died in a meeting room and returned as the woman who signed the contracts the moment before her heart stopped. They called her graceful, they called her an omen of fortune, and they passed the toast while folding her memory into a napkin. They wore my name like a costume, she thought with a bitter little laugh. For God's sake, I traded a life for a velvet ribbon. At the far end of the table, Evelyn Hale lifted her crystal and said softly to the room filled with clinking glasses, "We are blessed tonight." While across the table, Elara felt every bone in her body declared disposable. A small silver charm sat in the center of the table, cool and ridiculous, blinking as if it had a pulse of its own. There was calculation in the way the matriarch smiled, and there was something older in the way the charm hummed when Elara passed her hand near it. In the next hour, you will see how the so-called simple wife, presumed weak, was in fact a reborn being with a power that no boardroom bargain could contain. How do you react when a city trades a soul for an inheritance and believes the transaction is normal? Because this story starts where the papers stopped reporting. Begin with the morning everyone decided what to do with a life they no longer recognized. When Elara Val arrived at the glass building that morning, she had an umbrella, a city map folded into the back pocket of her jeans, and a refusal to let anyone carry her grocery bags. She was 32, with a scar on the inside of her left wrist from a bicycle fall when she was 8, and a laugh that the neighbors said could wake sleeping dogs. She had been an assistant at a small publishing house for 10 years. She had rent receipts stacked like careful little altars and a burned photograph of her mother laughing in the sun. Victor Hale had been a name on a billboard until it became a phone call he did not expect. The Hales were the kind of family that measured affection in square feet and signatures. Elara's death in the atrium was a headline for one day and an opportunity for someone else the next. When she opened her eyes to the smell of brewed coffee and lemon marmalade, she realized her passport had a different photo, a different signature, a different history that did not include the bakery on 3rd Street, where Mateo still saved a chocolate croissant for her. This was not amnesia, this was substitution. The new family welcomed her with soft voices that hid teeth. "We always needed someone like you," Victor said with a half-smile, standing in the doorway of a house that smelled of polished oak and old money. His eyes were practical, the kind that had been taught to inventory value. Evelyn Hale, the matriarch, arrived in a shawl the color of storm clouds and hands that had never learned modesty. Isabel Hale, the daughter who had always been promised to a senator's son, smiled the smile of someone unaccustomed to surprise and yet perfectly prepared for it. Marcus Reed, the corporate cousin, offered applause that felt like a ledger being balanced. "She will complete the image," he said. A chorus of names formed a court around her. The maid, Rosa Alvarez, carried a tray and watched Elara with eyes that did not pretend. Simon Park, the lawyer, had already placed a thick file on the coffee table. Nora, a quiet neighbor who had known Elara before the change, appeared briefly at the window, like a ghost from the life she had been stolen from. Elara's voice, when she first answered, "My name is Elara Vale," was small and strange in that room that had decided she was something else. They answered her in syllables that belonged to contracts. The charm on the table sat and watched. She remembered a childhood that smelled of rain and wet pavement, of the bakery on 3rd Street where the baker Mateo would hand over leftover pastries with a wink. Her father had been a mechanic who taught her to listen to engines and to people in the same way, to find the small misalignments. Her mother had died when Elara was 16, a long illness that left a silence the family never learned how to speak around. There were details that did not belong to wealthy houses. Chipped cups, loose wiring in their apartment, a backyard wild with weeds where Elara taught herself to read by flashlight. She dreamed of university lectures she could not afford, and of nights listening to pirate radio. Then she went to work, stayed late, learned the names of authors like a litany. When Victor's car struck her by accident or by fate, she felt the world shudder into two parts. Everything before and the minute after. Someone else's name was waiting for her at a dining room table. That memory of the bakery, of Matteo's flour on his fingers, of the humming fluorescent light at the publishing house returned to her now like an accusation. She realized quickly that people with power traded in narratives. One life could be written over another if the page was heavy enough and the ink expensive enough. Her new daily routine was precise because everyone around her expected a product. She was to be the simple wife, the emblem of modesty in an empire of glass. At morning receptions, she wore thrifted sweaters beneath coats that cost like small countries. She smiled when instructed and nodded as if to show agreement. "We will take care of you," Evelyn would say. But care was measured in calendars and appointments. Victor's office smelled like strong leather and citrus cologne. He escorted her to charity dinners and to press events where flashbulbs made her skin look pearled. People introduced her in ways that trimmed her edges. Friends from her old life began to notice that she answered differently to their names. Nora left notes under the door. Matteo kept a pastry for her when he could. The inner contradiction widened. In public, she was proof of the family's generosity. Private, she was a woman who was cataloging evidence. That evidence included a small silver charm that had been pinned to a handkerchief when she woke. The charm had no family crest, no maker's mark, just an engraving of an impossible sigil. It was heavy and warm, as if it had been worn by someone breathing. The first humiliation came at a luncheon hosted by Ember Investments, a social arena where alliances were sealed with dessert forks. The table was perfectly arranged, and Isabel's laughter slotted into the space engineered for a future senator's steps. "Let the simple wife bless the cake," she said with a smile like a scalpel, and the room obliged. The public insisted on a narrative of gratitude. Cameras loved the image of humility, but the camera could not see what a plate felt like when thrown at someone who had just been told they were a calculated acquisition. Ilara sat still as the biting comments landed. She answered each barb because it was expected. Yet every time she said thank you, a memory pushed against her ribs as if to escape. Conversations around her followed a pattern of ownership. "She understands the communities we are trying to reach," Simon Park explained to a journalist named Hannah Cole. "She knows charity from the inside." "From the outside," Nora muttered from a corner, and a waiter almost spilled coffee because he was not supposed to hear the neighbor. The charm at her throat warmed like a living thing each time someone decided her fate. There was a small, sarcastic voice inside her that said, "You should have negotiated better. You should have taken legal counsel," and a louder voice. It said it and then went quiet because the world had already decided to call her meek. At night, she lay awake and listened to the house breathe. There was a rhythm to wealth. Many doors, soft carpets, the faint click of someone counting numbers in their head. Victor slept like a man who trusted systems more than people. Evelyn held court in the sitting room, fingers tracing the patterns of a lace handkerchief. Marcus worked late in a study with the faint smell of printer ink and old paper. Isabel practiced her smile in the mirror and pretended not to hear the clock. Rosa, the maid, spoke occasionally to Ilara in private. "You were different the day you came in," she said, pressing a tea bowl into her hands, the steam smelling of citrus and old leaves. "Different how?" Ilara asked. "Like someone who knows something they will not tell." The words landed and made a sound like pebbles dropping into still water. Inside Ilara, a name thrummed that was not Victor's and not the one stitched to her dress. Something remembered sunlight on a green tongue of meadow's edges, a scent of wild thyme and riverstone. It was a memory that belonged to before the city's ledger and the family's will. The first signs of power were small and almost comic enough to dismiss. She would pass a lamp and the light would tilt, not because someone had adjusted a dimmer, but because the wire seemed to sigh. A portrait would slant to face her in a room where no breeze stirred. A spoon in a sink would bend minutely, as if acknowledging her presence. Once, at a charity gala where the air was thick with perfume and cheap ambition, she touched a bouquet, and the roses exhaled in a sudden bloom that made the room inhale. Isabel looked at her and paled slightly, as if she had seen a reflection of the wrong face. The charm warmed against her skin whenever she told a truth, and shivered when surrounded by lies. A conversation at a late-night legal briefing between Simon Park and Marcus Reed contained a line, "We can make her useful and then set her aside." And when it passed, Alara felt a coldness like rain and bone. Her first spoken retaliation was not violence. It was a small thing. At a fundraiser, when a donor named Peter Dalton attempted to move a sculpture away from her stead, he bumped his wrist and the band of his watch snapped. He laughed it off, but his fingers trembled. Later that week, he canceled a promised donation, and later still had a small accident, leaving a smear of red on a foyer carpet. They comforted him. They read it as misfortune. Backstory for Alara was folded into her like letterheads. She had learned to make bargains with silence because the world she grew up in required compact, practical trades to survive. Her childhood had taught her to listen for shaking sounds and to interpret the smallest changes in tone. At 14, she ran away for a week to a coastal town and learned to collect shells. At 19, she worked 3 jobs to keep a roof. At 26, she lost a lover to a city that had no compassion for weakness. She had an aptitude for noticing patterns that others missed. This aptitude had always felt like a superfluity in the life she once led. Then, when the charm first illuminated under the dining room lamp like an eye-opening, she realized that the aptitude was not a talent, but an inheritance. She was a creature older than the contracts and the calendars, a being whose memory had been buried and replaced. The realization shook her like a storm. The matriarch's cruelty grew with the seasons. Evelyn commanded the house with an economy of remarks. "You must smile," she told Alara during a private tea, the room smelling of bergamot and old wood. "You represent our charity's softer face." Alara answered with a soft assent. They spoke in economies of purpose. "We were careful to choose a simple story for you," Simon Park confided once over paperwork that smelled faintly of disinfectant. "A past that will not be questioned." To appear non-threatening became a sentence. Yet every humiliation sharpened something inside her to a fine edge. She started to practice speaking not to explain, but to disarm. In those private rehearsals, she consulted with a small handful of allies that fate threw her way. Nora, who had kept a ceramic cup with Alara's name on it, Matteo, the baker, who still left a pastry on the counter for what he insisted was habit, and Father Matteo, the priest, who had known both Matthew the mechanic and the family's history in the neighborhood. He said one night while sprinkling holy water that sometimes old things return because they had unfinished business. The priest's words tasted like incense and caution. "There is a lineage," he whispered, "something passed down in laughter and in hush." Alara catalogued the words, the names, and the small kindnesses like evidence. The storyline expanded when a local journalist named Hannah Cole published a lifestyle piece about how Victor Hale's charity was bringing authenticity into high society by including one wife from outside their class. The title read like a headline designed to soothe. "Local woman becomes heart of new philanthropy." The article included a photograph of Alara with her hands folded and a charm at her throat. Comments poured online. Some applauded the family. Others, who knew the small details, left more honest notes. The image, however, created a public record that only deepened the contradiction of her life. People began to theorize, to assign meaning. Marcus and Simon used the article to justify plans for a new foundation. Authenticity sells, and we will monetize trust, Marcus declared at a management meeting with the kind of confidence that smelled like cologne and raw ambition. Peter Dalton, the auctioneer, saw opportunity. He proposed a benefit auction to raise funds and to solidify the narrative. The house prepared to auction not only art, but also the illusion of sympathy. The auction scene must be long and intricate, because society will be the crucible that turns private humiliations into public war. The room was a ballroom with high windows and a scent of lemon oil. There were bidders with names and accents and smiles sharpened by legal teams. Peter Dalton presided with the theatricality of someone who knows the value of spectacle. "Lot 33, he announced. "An afternoon with our philanthropic family and items donated by the house." Bidders raised paddles. "Will this raise enough to change a neighborhood?" someone asked. "It will raise more than a neighborhood," Peter replied. "It will raise reputations." At the back sat Marcus and Victor, measuring the crowd. They were joined by Lucia Chen, an art curator who had loaned a painting that, if sold, would fund a new wing of an institute bearing the Hale name. The lights shone, the speechmaker spoke of legacy, and Alara's charm thrummed like an insect caught in a summer jar. She stood supporting a scene that called itself virtue. As someone in the crowd, a man named Theo Vargas, who had known Alara in passing, lifted his paddle, he thought of the pastry shop where her smile had been generous without interest. When the auctioneer struck the gavel, the room cheered, and Alara felt as if she had been sold in pieces. The public auction was a turning point, but it mattered more how the small transactions piggybacked on the big ones. Contracts were signed that defined her public role. "You will host the charity fair," Simon Park dictated, his pen a tiny metronome. "You will speak, you will receive acclaim, and you will be the heart." The paperwork smelled clean and clinical. It seemed like writing a fiction. At night, as the city slept under its neon breath, Alara would trace the engravings on her charm and feel images like film frames: a river, a child's laughter, a dwarfing oak. She confided in Nora and told the baker Matteo, "If I had to pick a place to be myself, it would be the smell of flour in the morning." Matteo laughed and told her that the world valued what it could display and sold at safe prices. "You have a look that surprises people," he said. "Use it to confuse them." Those words lodged and grew roots. The humiliation that precipitated the comment, CTA, happened at a gala where a dessert was sent back and a rumor was intentionally spread. Isabel had invited a friend from the senator's office who whispered over champagne that Alara was a plant, that the family had manufactured authenticity. A video taken by an overeager guest caught a moment when Isabel pretended to comfort Alara while the matriarch made a remark about how disposable the quiet ones could be. The clip circulated online. The hashtag began to trend. People began to pick sides. Some offered support. Many made cruel jokes. The room shared a private laugh at her expense. At that moment, you who are watching may have felt anger or powerlessness. If you did feel those things, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments, would you respond with silence to protect yourself, or would you fight back immediately? Reply with silence or react, and one sentence why. The community matters. The strongest comments will be used to create a small extra scene, and some will be read in upcoming videos. Your voice can shape how Alara chooses to move next. Now return to the story as she traces fingerprints on a plate. After the public humiliation, there was a moment when the house felt brittle. Victor began to speak in practicalities. "Damage control," he said, in a tone that smelled of legal drafts and late dinners. "We will issue a statement." Simon drafted a press release, as if sealing a wound with gauze. Marcus suggested a media tour to soften the blow. "We will frame it as growth," he insisted, "a moment of learning and grace." Nora went to her with simple advice: do what you need to breathe. That night, Elara walked the back streets where the city smelled of wet stone and gasoline, and sat on a bench watching a street vendor light a small lamp. A child nearby laughed at a puppet, and the sound pushed into her ribs with the force of truth. She visited Father Mateo, who had a small chapel with the smell of coffee and old wood. He listened and said, "Sometimes a life returns to finish a sentence." His voice was gentle, but there was a steel in it too. He pressed his palm to the charm, and it warmed as if recognizing kin. He spoke of the old language in which names were not mere labels, but contracts of the soul. The words were careful and old-fashioned, and they sat like seeds. Elara sought allies beyond the house. She met Armand, a man who styled himself a teacher of old ways, someone who had managed to keep the rumor of mysticism circumscribed enough to be invited into private rooms. He called himself a master, and he knew how to name things with precision. There was Lucia Chen, who lent her knowledge of art provenance and the shady histories of collectors. She offered Elara a different map. "Power is sometimes a story you tell with artifacts," Lucia said, finger tracing a catalog. Hannah Cole, the journalist, was curious, not to make headlines, but to understand. She asked direct questions and took notes. "If what you say is true, it alters what people consider marketable," she observed. "If people are sold a soul, they will keep buying until someone stops the auction." Nora offered practical help. Rosa, the maid, with her hands that smelled of lemon oil and laundry, slipped Elara small notes and black bread. The network grew like a braid. Elara's training with Armand began awkwardly, and then grew into something profoundly strange. He taught her to feel subtle currents, like a seamstress learns the grain of fabric. "First, learn to listen to the space between heartbeats," he instructed. In the small room where incense folded into the air, they practiced focusing on a scent and allowing it to open a memory. The exercises were sensory and tedious, but precise. "Close your eyes," Armand said, "and find the color of your fear." She smelled wet leaves and metal and tasted the cold iron of stairs she had fallen down as a child. He taught her to move intention like a whisper, to send it into an object and see what answered. The charm hummed and pulsed and responded like a living instrument. After weeks, she could make a small flame run along the edge of a candle without touching it, and feel a photograph tilt as if to show a face. These were not tricks for entertainment, they were calibrations. Armand said one night, "You are a reborn thing, once called a fairy in the small tongues of old communities. You learned to be human, and someone tried to rewrite that story. Now you must remember how to claim the old syllables." The training scenes were rich with sensory detail. They smelled of dust, tea leaves, the metallic tang of coins, and wet wax. Armand's hands were as rough as masonry. He wore a coat that smelled of pipe smoke and dried herbs. He had an old leather book filled with drawings of sigils and plants. There was also a curative that Lucia taught them about, a method of using plant tinctures to ground someone after they had altered an object's intention. The procedure required 3 measured breaths, an herb poultice, and a circle drawn with a silver thimble to focus attention. That procedural explanation was careful. First, prepare a basin of cool water infused with rosemary and sea salt. Second, rub the object along the water 3 times clockwise to remove residual energy. Third, allow the item to dry in moonlight and wrap it in linen for 48 hours. These steps help to neutralize lingering influence and prevent feedback loops during ritual work. The explanation was pragmatic and technical, and it felt like a manual for safe practice. As she learned, so did she name the people who mattered. Victor Hale, the CEO, Evelyn Hale, the matriarch, Isabel Hale, the promised daughter, Marcus Reed, the cunning cousin, Simon Park, the lawyer, Peter Dalton, the auctioneer, Lucia Chen, the curator, Hannah Cole, the journalist, Rosa Alvarez, the maid, Mateo, the baker, Nora, the neighbor, Theo Vargas, the old acquaintance, Armand, the master, Father Mateo, the priest, and Hannah's editor, Grace. These names formed faces and actions that moved like chess pieces. Each person carried motives and small gestures that revealed themselves like notes in a musical score. The network of social maneuvers expanded into a subplot of business that would bring the conflict beyond the house and into the city culture. The subplot that engaged the markets began with plans to found the Hale Foundation for Community Advancement and to place Elara as its public heart. Marcus orchestrated meetings with investors and selected items to be donated on behalf of the family as part of a strategy to secure tax breaks. "The foundation will be an investment in goodwill," Marcus said at a boardroom meeting with Lucia and Simon present. "We will brand the charity and place board seats in favorable positions." A proposal was drafted. Terms were read that would assign control of the foundation's assets to a trust the Hales would dominate. Documents with crisp typography and legal language slid across tables. A gallery owner proposed hosting a benefit where the photographs of poor neighborhoods would be displayed in a tasteful way that removed context and made poverty ornamental. Peter Dalton suggested an accompanying auction. Elara watched such meetings with a detached attention that made people misread her as naive. But she was not naive. She cataloged language, tone, pauses. She learned where the ledger marked weakness and where a silent pause could be exploited. The manor planned an inaugural banquet to announce the foundation and to celebrate the connections between culture and the Hale name. It was to be an affair of silk and applause. Invitations were sent, menus printed, a band contracted. The night arrived with the kind of formal choreography that smelled of roses and expensive varnish. Guests were guided down staircases by men whose smiles were workwear. The dining room held the weight of the wealthy in chandeliers and polished cutlery. Elara stood at the long table and spoke only when asked, her voice practiced to be humble and warming. Isabel watched her as if she were a painting to be owned. Marcus mingled, calculating and presentable. During the first course, a rumor circulated like a small flame. A young donor, thinking to curry favor, made a joke about how the family had made a theatrical gesture by inviting a simple wife to the table. Isabel laughed in a way that echoed. The room shifted. Beef served, and the sauce left a satin gloss across plates. The sensory detail was overwhelming. The taste of caviar that someone called subtle. The texture of bread that crumbled and made the tablecloth soft. The glint of cutlery. Elara felt the textures like a map. She felt the soft fabric of the dress she wore, the weight of her jewelry, the rise and fall of voices. A glass shattered in the receiving room as if to mark the moment. A public accusation erupted when a whistleblower released internal documents showing that the foundation's assets would funnel into several entities tied to the Hale corporate holdings. The charity was a veneer. The press swarmed. Isabel posted a compassionate statement. Victor released a video about commitment and community. Hannah Cole dug deeper. The revelation should have destroyed the family's narrative. Instead, it exposed fissures. Marcus lashed out in private meetings and accused those who leaked the documents of betrayal. "We manage perception," he told Simon in a voice the color of control. "We have long managed perception. This changes nothing." But perception was changing. The board resigned in droves. Sponsors withdrew. Peter Dalton found fewer bidders showing up to his auctions. Ilara watched as the house trembled along the lines of money and reputation. The charm at her throat grew warm, as if sensing an approaching crescendo. The antagonist forces were not only financial, they were ritualistic and social. Evelyn called a night meeting in a smaller study where the curtains made the room thick with shadow. She convened a small circle, including Marcus, Simon, and Isabel, to discuss a more decisive action than a press release. "There are things that must be contained," she said simply. "There are stories the world will only accept if they are kept tidy." The conversation slid into strategies that began to feel like spells of social engineering. It was conversation shaped to hurt the roots of dissent. They considered legal threats against Hannah, the journalist, and rumors about her ethics. They discussed making Nora seem unstable. They considered quietly transferring responsibility for some assets to a friendly trustee abroad. Their conversation had a ritual cadence. Each idea was a small ceremonial act toward erasure. They argued about the charm and its publicity value. In the end, they chose a plan that would force Ilara to the edge. A staged resignation of support from the family combined with a public exposure to make her appear unreliable and unstable. When the plan was enacted, it involved a staged night at the manor where Isabel would perform a cold withdrawal of affection in front of cameras. They rehearsed smiles and tears, and the press release would be immediate. The night became publicized. Guests were invited with specific stories to tell. It was a spectacle. At the house, a small crowd waited outside under umbrellas, and the rain made the world shimmer. Isabel took the stage and spoke of the impossibility of balancing private life and public role. "We must make hard choices," she said. The cameras were merciless. Ilara stood and tried to speak. She wanted to tell her truth. She opened her mouth and only a soft, hollow sound came out. The charm at her throat vibrated wildly. Then the room turned on her with a single motion, like a flock deciding to shift. "Give her time," they would say. "Move on," they would say. The humiliation became viral. She watched the video and felt as if someone had carved away a piece of her. In the comments section, strangers wrote cruel new names for her and suggested scandals. For a moment, the weight of humiliation threatened to crush her. The rage that replaced humiliation was patient. It did not erupt into obvious violence. It arrived as a plan to reclaim narrative, to take the tools the house used and expose them with their own language. She began to use the skills Armand had taught her, but with a precision he had not expected. She made small acts that made people reveal truths they had kept. She would touch a ledger and watch numbers rearrange in the minds of those who read it. She would stand near a microphone and the speech would falter, revealing the dishonesty behind rehearsed phrases. During a meeting where Marcus discussed hooving assets, she walked into the room and the air thickened like a glass bowl, filled with steam. "You will not do this," she said quietly, and then repeated it louder. Marcus sneered. "And what will you do, little wife?" he asked. There followed a sequence of verbal exchanges not of immediate violence, but of psychological dismantling, as she mimicked their tactics back at them. The scene contained many lines of give and take as she and Marcus traded barbs, each exchange digging further into the truth of their motives. It was a duel in syllables. One pivotal moment of tension occurred when she confronted Simon Park in his office about the documents. The lights buzzed like flies in a jar. "You signed them," Ilara said. "You knew." "I did my duty to my client," Simon answered. "My duty is to the law," Ilara replied. The conversation escalated into accusations, threats, and eventually a confession under pressure. Simon's face drained of color when she touched the corner of the document, and the ink bled, as if the paper remembered. He admitted in a broken voice the mechanisms of transfer and of shell companies. The room smelled of toner and coffee and fear. This scene took 2 days of writing in her mind, and then an hour of confrontation. It revealed that legal language had been used to make a life legible and tradable. It was a small victory because it produced evidence that could be handed to the press and to Hannah Cole, who now had contact details of a source willing to talk. Another moment of tension came when Peter Dalton refused to host the auction and then found himself under sudden scrutiny for a prior tax misreport. His office alarms were tripped by a small chain of inquiries that Ilara orchestrated with Lucia's help. His name began to appear in headlines, and he had to cancel the event he had so carefully designed to launder reputational capital. He called Marcus in anger, and Marcus called Victor, and the house felt like it had been punctured by small leaks. Each leak drew attention and allowed Hannah to collect stories that showed a pattern. The accumulation of small exposures made the family's story unstable. The city's appetite for scandal turned into a demand for justice. The stakes rose when the family, feeling cornered, resorted to archaic measures. Evelyn, fearful of losing the empire she had stewarded, sought counsel with a secretive group that had long advised the family on matters of reputation. They were practitioners of a kind of social manipulation with an edge of superstition. They believed in symbols and in the power of public belief. Create doubt, they advised. Make the people believe that the strange things that happen are unstable, that she is volatile. They planned a ritual not of the supernatural but of theater, a careful orchestration of acts designed to produce fear. On a night when the moon was a narrow crescent, they staged a kidnapping. Ilara was taken in a moment that felt like a scene. A van, muffled voices, hands rough and quick. She fought, and in that fight, something broke open inside her that was not entirely human. She felt the river memory unfurl, and for the first time acted with a physicality that made her captor shout. The ritual kidnapping was intended to humiliate and to break her by making her appear unstable if she surfaced incoherent. But the plan failed in a way they had not anticipated. She escaped in a scene of furious, almost fierce beauty. Her hands bled, her dress torn. She returned to the house not as a trophy but a living accusation. The family denounced the kidnapping and then attempted to claim credit for rescuing her to spin advantage. Victor spoke to the press in a voice made of neutral tones. "My wife suffered tonight," he said. "We will find those responsible." But the press saw the contradictions, and Hannah's reporting revealed the role of hired men and the family's counsel in creating the narrative. The public turned its attention to the family and asked questions neither the Hales nor the private counsel could control. At that moment, the mystical elements sharpened. Ilara discovered that the charm on her throat was not only a symbol but an anchor to the life that had been hidden within her. It was an object that held memory like a locket. When she pressed it to her palm, she saw an image flash. A childhood in a forest filled with small luminous creatures. A ring of elders speaking in a language like wind. A child plucked from a place of green and river and placed into the city's ledger. She learned the word her people had used, a term that in old tongues meant both guardian and borrower. She was a reborn thing, a being whose lineage carried a responsibility to keep balance between the human and the old wildness. That realization changed the terms of the conflict. It was no longer only about money and reputation. It was about reclamation of identity and the refusal to be traded. At the climactic confrontation, she called a gathering in the manor's main room where chandeliers hung like jealous moons. The room was full of people whose lives intersected with the Hales, investors, journalists, friends, and enemies. She arranged the meeting to expose the truth in plain sight and to force the family to either continue to hide or to confess. The night smelled of lemon oil and heated fear. She stood and told a story, then another. She let the charm hum and let images spill into the room like projected light. People felt it like a draft that outlined their shame. She spoke of her mother's laugh and of the bakery's warm bread and of a name that could not be bought. Victor tried to interrupt. "This is slander," he said. "You cannot make these accusations without proof." She smiled. And documentation from Simon, a recorded confession from a shell company associate, an art piece whose provenance Lucia traced and that tied the foundation to illicit transactions. Hannah broadcast the meeting live with a camera that had become a sword. The room contracted. Evelyn's face crumpled, and then, in a move desperate and human, she attempted to seize the charm. "You are not fit to hold this," she hissed. "You are a danger to what we have built." There followed an exchange of words that was almost a chant, voices sharp and brittle. The family's defenders rose to their feet and attempted a social coup. The guests murmured. On live feed, the city watched a family unmake itself. In the climax, there is a duel that is not purely physical. It is a duel of truth and of old power. Ilara called forward the witnesses who could connect the facts and the older memories. Father Mateo offered a quiet testimony about community ties. Lucia showed an object from a private collection that had once been taken from a village near a river. Sinan, forced by moral recoil, produced signed documents. Marcus lunged. In the confusion, a small flame licked the curtains and then went out as if someone held a breath. She moved without thinking and pointed her hands, and the charm responded, sending a pale light across the carpet that made faces look like maps. In the shocked silence, someone began to weep. Evelyn, cornered, attempted a last move, to obliterate her by telling the city that Ilara had been unstable from the start. It was a final narrative sweep, a move to claim motive and rewrite the moment. Yet the network of small evidence built from the auction, the recordings, the confessions, the art provenance, the press inquiries, all converged, and the family's hold on the city frayed. The fall of the household's dominance was not instant, but forensic. Contracts were voided, board seats resigned, a foundation dissolved. The Hales found themselves publicly accountable for what had been secreted under charity and reputation. Marcus faced legal charges. Peter Dolphin lost clients. Simon turned into a whistleblower and sought mercy in exchange for testimony. Isabel moved abroad and posted statements about growth and privacy. Victor's company stock dipped and then reconfigured. There were hearings, there were investigations, there were press conferences where the language of accountability turned into legalese and then into human confession. During those days, Ilara became both a burden and a hero depending on who you asked. Some charities that had been parasitic returned funds. Some community projects were restructured under public supervision. Lucia organized an exhibition to restitute an object to a community that had been misrepresented. Hannah's reporting won awards and forced institutional change. The city watched a narrative flip that had been assumed stable and learned that power could be porous. There were moments of intense tension after the legal actions began. One such moment occurred in a hearing where Marcus, under oath, faced a witness who produced bank transfers traced to shell accounts. The air in the room was sterile, and the microphones captured each swallowed breath. Marcus's manner cracked, and he sat with his hands folded in a way that made his voice tiny. "I never meant to break anything that mattered," he said, and the line sounded like a small thing calling for help. The jury of public opinion had already started its verdict. The legal machines churned. Another moment occurred when Victor was confronted by an old neighbor who produced a recording where Victor had coached staff to maintain a specific script about gratitude. The recording played and Victor's face blurred. The city felt like a scale being righted. The mystical climax came when Evelyn attempted a final ritual to reclaim the charm. She called in a group that had long advised the family in matters of reputation and symbology. They gathered at midnight in the library, candles guttering and the smell of wax and old books filling the air. Evelyn chanted a sequence of phrases of her own making, not archaic language, but polished words that meant to sway belief. The air tightened. The charm flared. For a breath, it seemed as if the house of glass would respond and bend to Evelyn's desire. Then Ilara entered with a small group including Armand and Father Mateo. She did not confront with violence. She moved through the circle and sang a word that had not been spoken in the city for generations. The sound was like water over stone. The charm answered, and the light that flowed from it struck the circle and made faces look old. Evelyn fell back, astonished. She had traded in systems but had not understood the thing she tried to make a symbol. She had attempted to control what she did not comprehend. When she reached for the charm again, her hand passed through light and she felt only air. The charm had chosen. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the city rearranged in small, practical ways. There were legal settlements and also small restitutions. The story of Ilara, once called the simple wife, became one of many conversations about power, about the ethics of charity, and about who is allowed to trade in narratives. She did not choose revenge in the grotesque sense. She chose reclamation and the enforcement of consequence. Marcus faced legal scrutiny, Victor negotiated resignations, and Simon's career changed into one of contrition. Peter Dalton went bankrupt. Isabel's marriage dissolved under the strain of reputation. The epilogue unfolds in 3 temporal beats that reveal not only personal change but social transformation. 1 month after the fall, the manor was quiet. The rooms smelled like dust and lemon, and the gardens were untended. Ilara visited the bakery on 3rd Street and sat with Mateo, who placed a warm pastry before her like a truce. She told Nora that she was starting a small fund seeded with return donations and with money from a trust set aside by Lucia to fund actual community projects. The city spoke in small articles about accountability and about the resilience of civic institutions. There were public conversations in town halls where Hannah moderated panels about ethics in philanthropy. People gathered, and the word restitution started to have weight. Ilara felt the first small relief of being heard and believed. A month later, she began teaching a small workshop about cultural stewardship, inviting people from neighborhoods to talk about heritage and about being visible without being exploited. The charm at her throat was quieter now, but when she placed it on a table in sunlight, it warmed as if content. 3 months later, the foundation the Hales had created was legally dissolved, and an independent trust took its funds with oversight committees that included longtime community members like Father Mateo and Lucia Chen. The public record closed some accounts and opened others. Marcus awaited trial, but some charges were negotiated into restitution. Victor's company restructured with new board members and pledged to implement transparent giving practices. The city's cultural institutions began to partner directly with neighborhoods. Ilara traveled to a small riverside village for an exhibition where the restituted object was returned. The village danced at the site, and the ceremony tasted of salt and bread. She felt at the edge of something that had been reclaimed. People who had been silenced were speaking, and the language of accountability had become a tool. The charm at her throat pulsed like a heartbeat, in time with the village drums. 6 months later, the transformation was deeper and quieter. Ilara had declined offers to return to the public stage as a sensation. Instead, she had used returned funds to seed programs that taught young people crafts that had been misused by collectors. She organized a cooperative market where makers kept ownership of their work. The city's conversation had changed from scandal to structural critique. Laws were proposed to increase transparency in philanthropic giving and to protect cultural heritage. Hannah Cole's series on the Hales had become the basis for a documentary that the network picked up. Marcus's trial concluded with penalties and mandated community service. The manor was sold, and the new owners turned the property into a community arts center, with spaces open for workshops. Alara stood at the opening ceremony and spoke briefly. She did not frame herself as a hero, but as a conduit for a larger correction. She emphasized that there was no clean closure in such stories, and that work remained. The charm rested in a small box at her side, no longer a tool of power, but a reminder of a history that had been bought and nearly sold. The final note she left with the city was this: a promise that she would continue to guard what had been reclaimed and to teach others. How to refuse being traded. The final lines of the story are a quiet recapitulation. She had been taken, traded, and almost buried. Those who thought they had displaced her had underestimated what returned stronger than fear. The family that had thought itself the author of other people's narratives ended up being subject to its own story's collapse. People lost positions, money changed hands, and the city learned how its appetite for spectacle could be redirected toward justice. In private, Ilara learned to harness the strange ancestral force in ways that honored the past instead of weaponizing it. Her redemption was neither simple nor solitary. It involved lawyers who turned, friends who risked their reputations, journalists who refused to be bought, and a community that reclaimed its voice. If you want to follow the continuing journey of those who were overlooked and then found, subscribe and stay with us because there are many more stories like this, and the next twist might be more complicated than this one. The destiny was exchanged, yes, but choice remained with the one who lived it. The life was reclaimed and the choice endured.